there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this Alchemi-Culture episode. I am your host, Phoenix Aurelius, and today I am joined by Warren Kistenbroker. Warren has been a homie of mine for a long time. We never even met, though, until, 2 years ago, I think, at the Good Medicine Confluence. But we had been kind of like Facebook colleagues for a long time in a lot of the Alchemy and Spagyric groups going back, 7 or more years ago now. And I remember when we first started like connecting, he was one of the only bros that was within the alchemy and kind of Spagyria circle was actually pushing the envelope of what is possible and looking at things from a more scientific angle and a more kind of chemically oriented angle, which at that time to me was really amazing and really refreshing because there weren't many people at that time really doing it. You had people who were very deep into the Rosicrucian kind of tradition and talking about alchemy in the same way that alchemy has been talked about for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was remaining elusive and using all sorts of elusive terms. Warren was one of the dudes stepping up and talking about phytochemical constituents and mycochemical constituents and talking about the iatrochemical reactions that we would see, talking about esterification, talking about isolation of various alkaloids, talking about different types of things in modern chemical language that really help bridge the gap for a lot of folks at that time. And many of you who've watched this podcast know that I think the world of Daniel Wiseman because he oftentimes does very similar things. And in my opinion, the top 3 Spagyrists that I absolutely love, besides myself, of course, who are talking about these types of things, are Robert Allen Bartlett and Daniel Wiseman, and then Warren is kind of the third. And I knew Robert before all of them, but then Warren was the next. And I've just always had a kinship with this guy because we're about the same age. We're very interested in a lot of the same things. And it's just been an awesome, awesome time working with him and then actually finally getting to meet him and hang out with him. And Courtney at the Good Medicine Confluence the last couple of years, it's an absolutely amazing thing to be able to share space with this guy. And I am extremely pleased to bring him to the Alchemi-Culture community. So Warren, thank you so much for joining us, man. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Yeah, thanks for having me here.
It's a pleasure, believe me. So, go ahead and tell people who maybe aren't familiar with your work, kind of what you're doing right now, and tell them a little bit more about your business, Evolved Alchemy, and like what you're doing with that business.
Yeah, so I started Evolved Alchemy in 2015. And basically, my background was organic chemistry and electrical engineering. And so I came from a very scientific mindset. And, I'll also say that I was so into the scientific realm that I was convinced that, everything was a probability, a number, a chance. And eventually I became more curious about spirituality and found a lot of really cool things in alchemical books that were really fascinating. And this started to really just jog my mind about what is possible and really understanding the asymptotes that exist within chemistry where there's things that we will never understand. And, Rudolf Steiner, one of his quotes is, esoteric science isn't the unknown science, but the science of the unknown. And that really, got me going with Spagyrics. And so really Evolved Alchemy has kind of been a hub for me to integrate a lot of my scientific background and also, merging that with the wonders of alchemy and kind of the unknown science of, I think of Spagyrics as really a chemistry lesson that you're learning from a plant that's millions of years old, and that chemistry lesson will cease to exist when that plant goes extinct. And so through Spagyrics, we're able to kind of reconstruct and learn from these plants, both, energetically and, physically, chemically, through the experience, the taste, the smell, all of it. But yeah, Evolved Alchemy is kind of just a hub to kind of merge those two. And that's always been my mission of bridging science and spirit. And as you were saying, that was why I got really interested in the chemical reactions, because I had made, my first Spagyric tincture was white sage. I just kind of picked that one, and it was a green tincture, as you'd expect. It's a green plant, and I just did a basic Spagyric. I didn't even extract the minerals from the ash. I just burned the ash and add the ash back. And over the course of 3 days, it turned from this green color to this dark purple, almost like a red wine. And I had been doing really intense chemical synthesis and isolation, where we're taking isoelectric compounds and basically crystallizing them and taking photos of them with NMR. And so I've been doing this like really pretty hardcore science. It's like the best method to prove a compound and understand its structure. And then, within that, we can only really take note of about like 4 to like maybe 6 chemicals at once. We know A turns into B, B turns into C. There's some intermediates, and then finally we'll get our product D. And within that, we can understand what we're doing. When it comes to Spagyrics, it's like we're going to take all the alcohol-soluble compounds, all the mineral water-soluble compounds from the ash, and then react them together. And there's no way that you could ever understand how many intermediates there are. And then, at the end, you can reproduce the same Spagyric medicine, essentially. There's different influences within the stars and whatnot, but, the science of Spagyrics is, it's a very procedural method, and you can repeat that. If you don't know what's happening within the Spagyric, to me, that was the unknown. But we're still able to do science and reproduce those results, using the same method. And that was really cool when I started seeing chemical reactions happen. And that's what, really inspired me to start looking into my textbook of, what's actually happening here in a chemical sense. I understand the alchemical references, but, as far as like talking to my, classmates about making
professors, right?
Tinctures. Yeah, I started making my own like gotu kola and ginseng tinctures, just to help focus in class. And so I'd always be taking tinctures in class. People like, what are you taking? And I'd be like, oh, it's this herb for memory. And the alchemical, references and symbology. Most chemists are going to be like, what are you talking about? This is a bunch of mumbo jumbo. And that's where I started really understanding that if I could explain these things in terms that a chemist could understand, they could really see the beauty in what Spagyrics is. And that was where I really started focusing on, trying to understand it in terms of chemistry as much as possible, but also like still keeping that wonder of alchemy that we really don't know what's happening, like in the very like specific chemical reactions, but through alchemy we can kind of understand more of what's happening energetically, and then through chemistry we can also understand why Spagyrics is more potent, more bioavailable. And to me that was my ticket of this is what I'm like kind of here to do. This is what I really understand. And so I came from very scientific background, and then was inspired by the wonders of alchemy, and evolved alchemy was born really through trial and error. And really my go-to cola tincture, I made Spagyric, and I'd give it to my friends. And one of my friends who I like went to high school with, now I was in college with, he was like, can I buy a liter of that go-to cola tincture? And I was like, sure, what are you going to do with it? He's like, I'm going to sell it. I was like, you're going to sell it to people? And I was like, maybe this could be a business someday. If it's, I was just making it for myself. And then for someone to be like, I'm going to sell it. I love this stuff so much. I can focus and stay working all day and, I don't get like tired or like have to drink an energy drink or like drink a bunch of coffee.
Right.
And so that was kind of the initial, um, like idea. And then I'd say probably 5 years later of continuing to make Spagyrics, um, I basically in college, I got rid of my bed and I got a hammock so I could hang my hammock up and then I could have my little alchemical sock slit extraction corner. And then I had a little Tesla coil corner. And so it was this like beautiful, like symbolic kind of mirror of like, I'm going to do Spagyrics and alchemy. And I'm also going to learn about resin electricity. And those were like my two passions, that I was just doing for fun because I couldn't learn about that stuff in school.
Yeah.
So I just started doing all that. And then, yeah, eventually I think I took an economics class once and they taught me about the, supply and demand, rule of thirds, basically how to make a business functional. And I was like, all right, sweet. I think I'm going to really do this. But
Yeah. It's
yeah, I
like
mean, that
on
and
from
along,
there.
I also worked for a company in Madison. This guy, Michael Ledger, really smart guy. He was the original person who taught me what Spagyrics was. I had already kind of known about it, but he was running a homeopathic laboratory. And so I learned a ton about CGMP, paperwork, and all that kind of stuff. And that's where I really got the skills to take evolved alchemy and know, how I'm going to put all this stuff in tiny bottles in a way that is efficient and energetically clean, as well as just knowing how to do all the paperwork, because that's like one of the bigger, um, barriers to entry is like, you just got to
Absolutely.
read the FDA thing and figure it out. So, with all that experience, I eventually moved to Colorado in 2015 to do Spagyrics, and I was mostly focused on working with hemp because that was like the first time we were legally able to work with a form of cannabis that I had seen some really amazing results from. And it's not the only herb out there, but that was one of the most inspiring herbs at the time, just because it was under such scrutiny. Um, so yeah, since then I've just continued innovating and building out bigger extractors, and I always try and just make things faster. That was like my background in chemistry and biotech was to like, I was kind of like a little robot.
Yeah,
So it's
totally.
fun to have my own lab.
Well, yeah, well, and you've done some really cool things. I mean, I remember years ago, this was probably like 2018, 2019, you had seen some crystallizations after adding in the mineral corpus back to like a spagyric pitch of cannabis, right? Like the fixed sulfur of cannabis. And you had seen some crystals. And I was like, oh, dude, like that's really awesome. I would love to do some IDF analysis on that. And you sent it to me. We remember figuring out like, oh shit, like it's kind of temperature dependent. Like those crystals are they'll be in flux if you get them back in higher temperatures than like when they actually develop. But I've seen that a bunch of times with all sorts of different types of elixir products. In fact, they pretty much always crystallize, which is interesting because it indicates that, whatever organic acids, more than likely, as far as I can put it together, whatever organic acids are inside of the fixed sulfur content, because I do have a couple of cases, Warren, where I have crystallized things inside of when we add in our purified potassium carbonate, the water soluble salt of salt. When we add that back into a tincture, typically the salts don't crystallize in the tincture. Oftentimes what you'll get is like a mass of salts staying at the bottom of a vessel that take on the color of that tincture, like they absorb the fixed sulfur, and that can be used as its own grade of medicine. As we've talked about the work of the elixirs for a long time. if you take that elixir and like work it a few times, then oftentimes, or just leave it for a long period of time, then it will start to crystallize in some really cool ways. But I do actually have one instance where I was tincturing fresh apricot blossom is one tincture, fresh dandelion flowers is another tincture, some plum blossoms, mostly stone fruit and then dandelion. And the tincture itself actually started to grow crystals inside of it as if I was growing like sodium chloride crystals inside of an aqueous solution. So I've seen that a couple of times, only with flowers, really, that one has happened. But when we're talking about the uh, fixed sulfur and the salts, like the elixir style crystals that we were seeing, um, what is your theory on that from a chemical thing? Because as far as I can deduce, it seems like the organic acids are actually reacting with the salts, and it's no longer a potassium carbonate based crystal that we're seeing. We're actually seeing a crystallized formation of a new, like, synthesized chemical, basically. Is that also your same understanding, or how do you view that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to kind of view it. But yeah, the minerals are, as we know, very basic. Potassium carbonate can also form buffers, which, like, it's a constant pH balancer, which can help with certain chemical reactions. And so within alchemy, they talk about circulation. And
Hmm.
circulation is also in chemistry known as reflux.
Right.
And there's a whole class of reactions that only happen under reflux. And what I think is really cool is we don't really know why you need to reflux it. And so, there's a reference to that magical alchemical idea of mirroring nature and having the circulation. Through that process, there's a lot of different things that are happening. But when you add your mineral salts, as you call them, organic acids, flowers are full of organic acids. And if you put a little bit of alcohol tincture in some water, you can measure the pH and almost do a little titration and figure out, just how acidic is it. But again, there's organic acids in flowers that also act as buffers. And so you have these really complex reactions happening between the minerals and the oils. And I also like to throw in that this is also the body and the soul of the plant. And only through alcohol or the spirit or the mercury can they react. And I think that is just, there's so much beauty in that understanding of, mercury being the messenger between the fixed and the volatile. And I've actually done experiments where you just have pure sulfur or, the pure like pitch and pure minerals. And if you mix them together, they don't really do anything. If you add a couple drops of alcohol, it'll start to bubble. And that was, really, really interesting. As you said, the minerals will take on the color of the tincture. And from what I've understood is that the carboxylic acids or the organic acids in, like, flowers and a lot of like aerial parts of plants will react with the mineral salts and they'll kick off a carbon dioxide compound and you'll get a potassium salt of that acid. And that's one of the reactions that happens. But, depending on if you're making an essence or you're making a first order elixir, you're almost like synthesizing different compounds based on what you're doing. If you're going to distill it over and over, depending on the herb, you're going to get a lot of those esters forming. If you have a lot of fixed sulfurs that don't really distill, you're going to create a lot of carboxylic acid salts, which are potassium salts with the organic acids. And then, so those are like, the first order elixir and the essence, they're kind of like opposites in terms of what you're producing. And then when you're making a tincture, I've seen this a lot with blue lotus. And I didn't know what was happening, but I'd throw the minerals in and, let it sit for a while. And there'll be this kind of powder that starts to crystallize on the inside of the glass.
Yeah.
And from my understanding, that is an alkaloid of some sort or some compound that is only soluble due to certain pH conditions. And alkaloids are like this class of compounds that are just, they're so interesting. And I'll reference, there's a book called The Evolution of Matter by Gustave Le Bon. It used to be like banned in some countries because he basically was like screw Einstein. But he has a lot of really, really cool stuff in his book where he talks about the idea of the aether or the ether. And, you know, in alchemy, it's kind of like the fifth element. But he talks about how ether is this substance that electrical things kind of, that's the dimension of electricity. It's not physical. They used to call it the imponderable. But he gives a really good statement. You know, we know chemistry in terms of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. Almost all biochemicals are made of these elements.
Yeah.
And we know how nitrogen, oxygen, carbon react, and we know how they work. But as soon as you have a complex biochemical, there's a whole new class of physics and chemistry that deals with biochemistry. Now, your carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen don't behave anything like carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. And in the case of alkaloids are like the most weird compounds to work with because they will change solubility based on pH, which gives it like kind of like another dimensional, you know, like understanding where like most herbs, we know it's either soluble in water or alcohol, you know, based on its polarity. And then you get alkaloids, and depending on the pH, you can change if it's soluble in water or alcohol. And so with a lot of those where you get the crystals growing on the inside of the tincture, I've thought that basically the potassium carbonate is reacted with the acids. You know, there's some kind of buffer that happens, and that might be why you see like maybe it stays stable or changes slowly over the course of like a few days or a few months. But as that pH changes, some compounds are starting to become less soluble, and they can make these perfect crystals. And, you know, another thing that I've learned in chemistry is that you don't get crystals growing unless you have something that's really pure. And that always boggled my mind that you could have this, you know, this slew of all these different compounds, and somehow you can get perfect crystals to form. And that, you know, I think also just shows the beauty in how plants are formed, and that they are these kind of like very evolved over time, you know, complex groups of chemicals that will allow certain compounds to crystallize. You know, if you go into chemistry, that's like unheard of. That's something that does not really exist. You know, you got to filter it and do all this like cleanup to get this super pure compound, and then you can get crystals. But you know, within the plant realm, there's, you know, it actually can be very easy. But you know, at the same time, if you don't really understand this stuff, I mean, it is magic, but without the understanding behind it, it's even more magical and mystical.
Yeah, totally. Totally, man. Like, yeah, like I can totally see where the old alchemists, you know, we're talking like late Dark Ages, early Renaissance type of time frame, where like that would have been mind blowing to be able to see reactions like that in the plant kingdom. And then of course, you know, working with minerals and metals and even animal materials, you know, basically mineral based animal materials like shells and hair and urine and things like that, and being able to see those types of crystallizations. They noticed that there were principles. I mean, that's like you can get it to happen pretty easily with, you know, what we could refer to as like very mundane chemistry. But in the realm of chemistry, like you were talking about, like it doesn't happen all that often. I kind of think that a lot of that is because of the intensity of the concept of isolation that chemistry focuses on these days. You know, it's like we're isolating active constituents, and they're just focusing on like, which is really cool. Like they know how to use the very particular solvents that are going to be able to extract, you know, a crude extract, and then to be able to change the pH or to, um, do different, like you said, like adding different substances to it or diluting it to certain degrees or heating it up, concentrating it, et cetera, in order to create or force crystallization through a very pure state. But it's really quite easy. If you get into the laboratory, like probably most people, including myself, who get into the Spagyric laboratory, just like yourself, we happen to cross that. Like we weren't trying to make that happen. It was something that like ended up happening. It's like, oh damn, what made that happen? And then you repeat the experiment or work on another herb and you'll find like, oh, well, some herbs lend themselves extremely well to that type of process, whereas other herbs don't lend themselves extremely well to that process. And over time, you start to see lowest common denominators, especially, one of the things that I remember doing was cross-referencing with Dr. Duke's phytochemical and ethnobotanical database. When I would work on an herb and I would see something really interesting in it, then I would go to Dr. Duke's and I would basically, find out all of the phytochemicals in that monograph and be able to find out like, okay, cool, this and this and this and this and this. Like you can pretty much throw most of the minerals out because unless you extract it with water, you're not going to get a whole lot of mineral content. So, magnesium in the plant, for instance, or like other things, like that's not going to be in any significant quantity where it's going to contribute to a particular type of crystallization. And even if it did, we would be able to know based on the type of crystalline formation that, was it orthoclinic or hexahedral or whatever type of crystallization. But you end up seeing, over time, as I would document that, it's like, oh, well, certain terpenes that I can find, like alpha pinene, for instance, always creates an interesting saponification with potassium carbonate. And that is probably why so many plants that have alpha pinene in them to some degree are really great for making spagyric stones. And if you notice, like turpentine, tremendous amount of alpha pinene is used in making the circulatum minus orbidurani, right? Or circulatum minus of orbidurus. And so which ends up being a solvent itself, basically creating like a semi-polar solvent that they call a circulatum inside of the alchemical literature. And so you like end up seeing like all of these interesting patterns if we can take the chemistry component and try to begin to understand like what is happening in the alchemical lab. And I think that that's one of the coolest things about our time, dude, is that we have the opportunity to look at alchemy through a lens that was not available to our predecessors. They came up with like spiritual reasons for why things were happening, because it was relinquished to the realm of the incredible, the amazing, like things that you would not otherwise see, that only the royal art would give you access to. And now, not to disregard any of that, because there are always spiritual and psychological allegory that accompanies physiological happenings, but we can begin to understand and philosophize about the chemical reactions that are happening and why they're happening. It's just a really, really cool time to be practicing alchemy, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, it reminds me of a quote by Fulcanelli, and he says, chemistry is a science of facts, while alchemy is a science of causes. And it's like, why do these two things react? And then there's a philosophy behind that. The facts are that they do react, and you don't question the cause or, the philosophy behind it. And I think that is really, really interesting to understand. And that's like what I think alchemy is really studying is, what are these causes and why are they these causes? And, to also touch on like, from a chemistry viewpoint, crystals don't really happen often because it needs to be really pure and all that. And that's where, when working with plants, we're working with bio compounds. We're not working with chemistry. We're working with biochemistry. And to touch back on that book, The Evolution of Matter by Gustave Le Bon, he says the reason that you need all this new chemistry that doesn't follow elemental chemistry is because these compounds are interacting with the ether. And because of that interaction with the ether, they have these weird chemical solubilities, changes, and you'll see stuff that you don't normally see in chemistry, like crystals coming out of a crude slew of a bunch of different compounds. And that's where I think, just like really thinking of that when you're working with plants, is that, chemistry is a great lens to try and understand things, but it's never going to fully understand it. And I think the idea of biochemistry and these compounds interacting with the ether, I also think of ether as kind of like almost the electrical everything, including consciousness. And when you're working with these biocompounds, they're also interacting with your consciousness, and the ether of, your own body. And that's where, I think there's just a lot of cool stuff that we'll see that science can never explain, but it's also important to try and understand it in terms of science, because science is like a very physical chemistry. But, as you said, the philosophy and the ideas behind it, they're all just mirrors of, explaining the same thing. We might not ever be able to understand, Spagyrics in terms of just philosophy, but we can get a really good grasp on how they figure this stuff out. And amazingly, it still works. Like, I always think of back in the day, I forget his name, but he was like the first guy to distill alcohol. And, it was the flight of the eagle. I'm pretty sure he thought he was condensing heavenly fire.
Yeah.
So, this liquid is disappearing, and then it's reappearing, coming down from the heavens, in the form of a distillate. And, you do that 7 times, and all of a sudden you can light it on fire.
Yeah.
That's straight magic. Now we know we just removed water every distillation, but the idea that you are gathering heavenly fire through each distillation, they still figured it out. And, depending on if you think it's just the water being removed or you're, gathering heavenly fire, it still makes sense. And that's where, I think it's really interesting to be able to see these older ideas and how they've also shaped our world, and the chemistry that's come in and portrayed it in a way that's like, oh yeah, duh, we figured it out. It does this. There's no magic here, but there still is magic.
But there is still magic.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it that way.
Yeah, that's the thing, man. That's the thing. Well, yeah, and as you're talking about that, it reminds me too of like taking that one step further. Basil Valentine, to the best of my knowledge, was the first to really talk about this. There may have been other authors throughout history who may have mentioned it, but Basil Valentine's fiery spirit was interesting. Have you ever heard of or made that?
I've read a little bit of Basil Valentine. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with his work.
Okay.
I've pretty much just like read a few books, and I just do a bunch of stuff in the lab.
Cool. Well, I'll describe this for you as well as for the audience then, because this is fascinating to me. Basically, he would take a copper Moor's head, okay, a copper alembic, with a long cylindrical tube. And at the bottom of that tube, he would lift it up off of the table surface, just, maybe a couple of inches. And then there would be a dish of alcohol underneath there. And then he would take a larger tube of copper and basically drill or cut a couple of holes in it, and then nestle that larger copper cylindrical tube kind of around it so that those tubes allow air inside of that chamber. Then what he would do is take basically like a little bit of wick and light it on fire, and then light that dish of alcohol on fire. So what's happening is that now you have basically a pyrolytic distillation of alcohol happening inside of this dish, but the vapors have nowhere to go because of the conductive air current, but up through that copper tube and into the alembic head. And what ends up happening, just like anything that burns or undergoes pyrolysis, is that it's constantly putting out vapors, right? Like you're not just like burning the alcohol and nothing's happening there. Even though it burns really, really clean, ethanol does, there's still exhaust to it. There is, you know, we're separating carbons, we're separating hydrogen through that burning process. And so you have all these hydrocarbon kind of materials that are evaporating out. And then because they're inside of a Moore's head that's passing through, you know, a condenser coil, eventually those vapors are going to condense. And he condensed those vapors and like smelled it. And it's like, of course, super volatile. But this became one of the most important circulata that is used in the higher works of alchemy, and it's known as the fiery spirit of Basil Valentine. And I forget, I did know at one point what the technical chemical name of that is, but it escapes me at the moment. But yeah, that to me is like really fascinating, you know. So like when we talk about alchemy in like this terms of evolution, you know, it's like from the first distillation of alcohol, which if they would have distilled it through glass, they would have been able to see like, oh, it didn't just like disappear. You know, distilling through ceramic, you have to be a much more skilled individual and much more in tune with your work. You have to understand volumes and things. Otherwise, you're bound to burn things or scorch things or carry water over with your work or other things like that. Whereas when you're working with glass, especially with alcohol, you see this awesome tube torus style distillation. And this is most evident anytime that you're using like an aludel or we call them chromatography reservoirs now, or especially an alembic distillation head, glass alembic, you can see that there is a tube torus style effect to the evaporation and distillation of alcohol. And it creates those beautiful legs that everybody likes to look at when they swirl their wine in a nice glass and see the alcohol kind of dripping down in these beautiful long patterns. You get to see that whole thing and it elucidates. So like the whole evolution, interestingly, of alchemy from like doing something the first time and philosophizing like what must be happening to it based on like, oh, it's fire water. Like if I distill this and I drink this, it's hot as shit and it alters my consciousness. You know, it's like it's fire water. And then like it also is flammable. Like, see, the element of fire is clearly within here. And then moving forward, like you get other people just like practicing that to such a degree where the distillation rectification process was just so standard by the time Paracelsus came along in the 1530s that people knew about that process so much, the magic of it had kind of disappeared to a certain degree, but it was such an important part that it became the spirit of the vegetable kingdom, you know. And so they philosophize like, okay, this is the spirit. And then with Basil Valentine, who actually was Paracelsus, like I feel comfortable enough saying that like it's a posthumous publication of Paracelsian work. I think Eric J. Laporte would agree with me on that. And there's a number of other historians, like academic historians, that I think have come around to that same thing. But the tone, the concepts, like everything, and like where Paracelsus mentions certain solvents and certain circulata and things, but never describes how to make them. Basil Valentine describes how to make these certain solvents and certain specifically menstrua, you know, circulata and menstrua that elucidate Paracelsus' work, and vice versa. You know, Basil Valentine will refer to something that Paracelsus himself elucidates more, but Basil Valentine never like talks about how to do it. And when you put those two works together, like they see eye to eye, they have the same type of religious tone and theological kind of understanding that's unique. And if Basil Valentine was actually a real person, we, especially a monk, as he claimed to be, we would have had some sort of record of that because the church kept immaculate records, especially of every monk coming in and out. And so we don't have any of that. Anyway, so yeah, you know, by the time Basil Valentine and his fiery spirit comes along, it's like a new octave of that concept of fire water, a new way of approaching how to be able to condense it, to condense fire, you know, from ethanol in a really cool and interesting way that is able to produce, you know, the concept being a quintessence. It pulls a quintessence of the herb. So you're pulling sulfur, mercury, and salt in equal proportions when you use that fiery spirit. or at least that's the philosophy. Chemically, I would love to have somebody adept enough who can take a look at a GCMS or HPLC type of thing and be able to say like, oh yeah, these spikes here, or this like region here means this. And of course, you know, I've got spectrometry equipment, pocket spectrometers and other things like that, but I am not an analyst. You know, it takes me a long time to be able to take a look at spectrometry and compare it to, you know, the scientific standards, be able to determine like, oh, okay, what do these spikes on this graph actually mean? What does it tell me? So I've got enormous amounts of data and really nobody qualified to read it or understand it. Because when I give it to chemists, they're like, I don't know what you did or how you got there, but I don't know what this means. I don't know what these spikes are even telling us. So
Right. And that's like, yeah, I had a lot of experience with that. You know, when I was in college, I would do GC, and HPLC and MR. And, you know, that was what I did. I was just like lab rat robot, just like computing data and loading samples, everything super procedural. And, that was, something I came across when I started working with hemp, because the cannabis industry had all this testing and data. And, you know, one of the biggest problems within that is standards and the idea or method of, you know, taking a compound, isolating it through either vigorous filtration or synthesis, and then crystallizing it. Then you can put it in, you know, a multi-million-dollar nuclear magnetic resonance machine, NMR, and take a picture of it. And then you could be like, it's got the right number of bonds, and it's got them in the right places, and it's got the right number of resonant bonds. So it is indeed the chemical that we drew on a piece of paper. It is actually that, based on all the probability of these bonds and everything. And then from there, you can take that and put it in a small amount of some solvent and send it off to a GC lab or an HPLC lab. And they use that as their standard. Some of those standards degrade after, you know, a couple of weeks to a couple of years, depending on what it is. And when you're working within the plant realm, that process I just described costs a ton of money
oh
to
yeah.
produce a crystallized compound, put it in a multi-million-dollar machine, pay a bunch of people to figure out, you know, what it actually is. And so standardization is just, it costs a ton of money. And when you're working with plants, it's like, cool, there's like 10 compounds that look really similar to one compound. We can't isolate them very well. And so standards don't exist. And, you know, I've had a lot of, you know, when I first started doing Spagyric hemp, I noticed that I was able to decarboxylate a lot of the acidic cannabinoids. But then there are also new peaks that were showing up in GC that had lower boiling points than you'd expect for cannabinoids. And basically, they're just like, here's your data. We have no idea what it means, but you got some cool peaks here that we've never seen before. You're doing something, and we can't tell you what it is. And
That's been
that
my
was just,
experience too.
you know, it was really cool, and it was kind of disappointing. Of like, all right, cool, I got this random chart of data with some neat peaks on it, and no one other than you know, someone who knows how to analyze data is going to be like, wow, that's cool. Otherwise, it's like, cool, I have data that doesn't actually really mean anything other than we're creating new compounds. And that's where, you know, it's just like furthering that there's magic happening. We don't exactly know what's happening, but we
We
can
can
repeat
see
it.
that something's happening here that's not usual.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, man. I remember actually along that same line with you working with hemp, you had actually spoken to something one time on a Facebook group about the biosynthesis of delta 10 THC, whereas in the hemp sample that you had when you tested the raw hemp sample, I think you had mentioned that there was absolutely no graph showing through the analytical method used that there was any delta 10 inside of the flower itself that was being extracted. But after the Spagyric process, there was now a pretty pronounced spike in the delta 10 region, which some plants do have delta 10, like it was known about, I think, as early as the 1990s, maybe even earlier than that. But you don't see it very frequently. And we were able to see that there is clearly a biosynthesis happening during that extraction phase with certain, maybe it was just with that flower or whatever, but you begin to see that unique and interesting things are actually happening there.
Yeah, I mean, I think within the world of Spagyria, just there's a ton of different reactions, there's a ton of different methods, and I think that there's, like I was saying before, you're learning chemistry from a plant, and depending on how you treat that plant, you can synthesize new compounds that hadn't existed before, or they only exist maybe in the plant with all its enzymatic activity, or all its different proteins that it has. But the idea that in spagyrics, when you add all three philosophical principles back together, that you're kind of reinviting the life force of the plant back into being, that seems very apparent through the complex compounds that are synthesized. And how those work together is something that, we should be doing a ton of research on clinically, but, as it doesn't pay the bills as much as
Yeah.
synthesizing some compound and making sure no one else could do it. But, and that's why I really appreciate your work and what you're sharing, is because, this is like really important stuff. It's working with plants, understanding them as medicine, and understanding through different lenses that are so inherently important. And if we lose sight of that, the pharmaceutical industry is not going to like help in all the ways that plants can. And that's where, understanding the entourage effect of plants, not just cannabis, that was like overly blown up when it came to cannabis, but there's the entourage effect applies to every herb. And that's where, through isolation, you lose that magic of entourage. And, within the research with hemp and cannabis, we've also found that CBD doesn't do anything if it's not with the other compounds. And that's where I think we see a lot in, pharmacology of like, this compound works this way. But it doesn't work that way when it's with a bunch of other stuff. And yeah, there's a kind of weird author, but Aleister Crowley has some quote, and he says, "If you kill the plant first, you can never be friends with it." And he talks about that in terms of isolation. And one of his references is like, you can chew coca leaf all day, run around, do all the things you need to do, and you can go to sleep until you're well rested. And as soon as you isolate that compound, it is so harsh that it can cause, addiction, all sorts of different things that you would not see in the plant itself. And, that was his way of kind of trying to portray this idea that if you don't keep the whole plant together, it's not going to be friends with you. It's going to like kind of attack you. It's going to be kind of harsh. And within spagyrics, you're keeping the whole plant together. Sure, it's like a crude form of all these different compounds, but within that, there's so much more happening than just one compound interacting with your body. And, I also just like to include that idea of interacting with the ether, that all these compounds are working together. And we've seen that in a lot of different plant extracts. Dr. Kenneth Profrock's classes with the tropane alkaloids was like one of the coolest classes I've ever taken. And he talked about how your body builds resilience to isolated compounds almost immediately. If you take an herbal compound that has a bunch of compounds that look very similar to the active ingredient, your body can't figure out how to become resilient. And in turn, plant medicine will work better than an isolated compound. And that's where, it just keeps furthering the idea that this entourage effect can be looked at in so many different modalities and different lenses. and produce results in ways that, depending on how you think about it, there's so many different possibilities. And that's where, within chemistry, there's only like one possibility, or two maybe,
Yeah.
based on probability. But like within Spagyrics and, your work and all the other, herbal methods of looking at different herbs and how they, interact with the body, there's so many different ways to do similar things with different plants. And there's just, so much magic and wonder in that. And also that research is like incredibly important because no one else is doing it. And so that's why, I've like decided like, let's just talk about it and tell people why this stuff works. Instead of like, at first I was like, I'm going to hoard this information and not share it with anybody because it's, worth a lot. A lot of people have that
Yeah.
mindset, and I was like, I get that. And no one's going to fund my research except for me.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't want to invest against big pharma, which inherently is like tied to the oil companies because we take crude oil and chop it up into a bunch of different compounds. And it's a lot, and it's, but in the end, this stuff is still so important that, we have to do it. And, even just having podcasts like this, having like-minded conversations, and also knowing like the differences that people have, but like getting on the same page with everybody, this is progress. And
Big progress.
that's
First
like,
time in history that like alchemists have the opportunity to actually talk about things in a relatively open way with one another. Besides just like, in the past, it was like, I publish a book, you read the book, and you're like, that guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about because he's using like all of this weird terminology. Here's the way it actually happens. You publish the counter book, and like, it kind of becomes like warring warring factions almost, even though like from an objective perspective we can look at those books and be like, actually their process, like Raymond Lilly's Spirit of Wine and Paracelsus' Spirit of Wine, are almost identical. They both come out to be damn near diethyl ether with a small amount of water and a small amount of ethanol in there. It's like they were talking about the same thing but using different terms. Paracelsus was adamant, like Lilly doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, and vice versa. So yeah. Anyway, this gives us a great spot. We're going to go ahead and go to a commercial, folks. We'll be right back. And as soon as we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about alchemy and Spagyria itself, drawing it out of the chemical realm that we have spent a lot of time talking about here, and talking more about the spirituality and the psychological aspects of it, and then also talking about electrical alchemy or electric alchemy, which is one of the coolest things, in my opinion, that Warren is really specializing in and really needs to get out to the world. So go ahead and stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, we are always searching for the very best wellness supplements and therapies. Perennially speaking, there are some key fundamentals to maintaining a healthy body and mind, one of which includes consuming high-quality mineral nutrition through a healthy diet. There is an issue with that though, because even with an all-organic diet in today's world, our diets are still lacking the important trace minerals due to soil depletion and unsustainable farming practices over the past few decades. So as a result, we have found that most people's diets need to be amended with mineral supplements. And our favorite company for that is called Mother Earth Minerals, and they happen to be also a local company based out of Ogden, Utah. This company is our favorite because they provide minerals in angstrom size, which is the optimal particle size for bioavailability in humans. Highlights about this company include the water that they use in the creation of their supplements is actually steam distilled to a medical grade purity to ensure no vibrational and/or physiological impurities whatsoever. Also, the mineral elements that they use are verified by a third-party lab to be 99.9% pure, ensuring the utmost purity in their final product. Something else this company does that sets them apart is that they end up redoxing the product before it is bottled for the final sale. What that means in layman's terms is that the supplement gets added biophotons and electrons in order to increase the effectiveness and bioavailability of the whole product 100-fold. When using Mother Earth Minerals Angstrom Mineral products, you can rest easy knowing that you have a cellularly bioavailable and non-toxic form of each mineral, as cells only hold on to the angstrom-sized particles if they need them. And if they don't, then they're actually just stored by the extracellular matrix or else flushed out through the body. So your body will actually utilize and absorb the product, making your money spent on your supplements well worth it. We are an affiliate of Mother Earth Minerals, and we do love helping to spread the word about this amazing company and their products. And as always, we would never endorse something we are not ourselves 110% in support of. So if you would like to get started with remineralizing your body, simply use the link in the description below. And as always, thanks for supporting this podcast with your purchases.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you again so much for joining us for this episode of the Alchemi-Culture Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Phoenix Aurelius. Today, we're talking with Warren Kistenbroker, and we are chatting about alchemy and Spagyria now. Hopefully, you were able to catch in on part one of this interview. It was absolutely fascinating, especially for those of you who come from a more chemically minded kind of viewpoint and a more modern viewpoint of things. This conversation has really been fascinating. I think those of you who are listening who have a familiarity with Spagyrics and alchemy and chemistry will really dig that first part. We're going to switch a little bit now. We're going to talk a little bit more about the alchemical component of Spagyria and what we would call the philosophical component of it. For a little bit, because realistically, Warren, this is the basis of where our tradition of Spagyria was handed to us from, was all philosophy. And all the time when I teach my students, a lot of people come in and they'll specifically ask, like, well, if you add water, aren't you going to get the most amount of phytochemical constituents when you're doing this extraction? And I have to tell them all the time, yes, but Spagyria and alchemy as well is not about getting the most out of something. Like, we're not looking at it from the chemical perspective of get everything that's in there. We're looking at it from the philosophical perspective. And the philosophical perspective here is that if you're going to use water, use pure distilled water. And then you can make essences, like water-based essences. You can, of course, distill essential oils that way. You can do lots of different types of things with just water alone. But if you're going to be working on a philosophic level, the primary volatile mercury of the vegetable kingdom is ethanol. The fixed spirit is glacial acetic acid. And so we have to stick with just what these different types of solvents are going to be extracting and work within the philosophical context of Spagyria. And that produces entirely kind of different results. And people need to really wrap their mind around that, I think, because so oftentimes we get our wires crossed and it's like, how do I get the most out of something? And more does not necessarily equal better. And Spagyria kind of paints that picture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And, a lot of it, I don't have a big herbal background. And so
That's ironic to hear.
I know a lot about herbs. Yeah, I mean, I've just never gone to school for herbalism. And so I like to work with herbalists, Evolved Alchemy. I'm mostly a product manufacturer, so I work with herbalists. They come up with their own formulas. I make stuff for them. And then they don't have to invest in all the equipment and whatnot. And, one of the areas of, Chinese herbalism, they always use water extract. And so they're like, what are you doing alcohol extract? And they're like, we've never done that. Everything that we've done for thousands of years is based on water. And I was like, maybe you should think outside of the box a little bit and think that there's also other things that can happen. But something that was interesting is a pure alcohol extract of certain Chinese formulas actually acted differently than what they are used to when they do water extract.
Yep.
And so, within Spagyria, of using 95% alcohol, or as pure as alcohol as you can get, there's a slew of reactions that only happen when you have really high grade alcohol. And that, I think, is, painting this philosophical picture that there's basically these unknown compounds that only exist when you make a spagyric with 95% alcohol, and you add the mineral salts and circulate it with a little bit of heat. That does something totally different than what most herbalism is used to.
Yeah.
And within that is important because all these other forms of herbalism have figured that out. They know what they know. But within spagyrics, there's so much more to understand. And, me being a more scientifically minded person, I've only been able to understand that in terms of chemistry of like, oh, this stuff only happens when you don't have water. And actually, water will disable those compounds from being formed.
Especially with
Esterification,
esterification, right? Like you can't really get esterification happening in a high aqueous solution. It has to be like if you could use 95% or even better, 100%, you get a greater amount of esterification than if you were to say even use like an 80 or 70% ethanol solution, right?
yeah, I mean, what's really cool is, so esterification is a carboxylic acid that reacts with alcohol, and it basically makes an ester, which is a carboxylic acid attached to an alcohol group, and it makes water. And so when you make a tincture, you're making, even though you start with 95% alcohol, through esterification reactions, you're actually producing more water. And that sits at equilibrium. That's an equilibrium reaction. And so the ester is essentially the spirit and the soul together. That's an ester, where you have, that oil or carboxylic acid, that sulfur attached to mercury. So you have this, soul spirit fusion, but it makes water. And this was like my big aha moment, looking at spagyrics. As soon as you add the body, which, grounds the volatile, it literally does do that. It literally can take, basically it absorbs water. As we all know, the salts are, they'll absorb water right out of the air, and they'll make like, you can dry your salts, and then if you're in a humid environment, a few days later, if you leave them out, they're like a little weird slurry again.
Yeah, they make the oil of tartar,
Yeah, and so that just shows how much they pull water out. And so as soon as you add your mineral salts, the body is actually going to catalyze the reaction of esterification, because now, your equilibrium reaction that has water on one end, now the water is being absorbed by the mineral salts, and now all the esters can form. And so if you have any bit of water in your tincture, you're going to hinder that esterification reaction. And what's also really cool is esters are really stable compounds once they're formed, typically. And those esters typically also have lower boiling points than their pure carboxylic acid. And so that's where, if you look at stuff on GCMS or whatever, you might see compounds that have lower boiling points form, and those are likely esterified carboxylic acid, which in the philosophic understanding is literally a soul spirit fusion. And those probably have a whole slew of interactions in their ester form because they're philosophically a soul spirit fusion. Yeah, and then there's other reactions that happen with the body and the grounding of that, but yeah, I mean, esters in general, they almost can't happen if there's water present, and that isn't something that the general herbalism community knows. From Chinese herbalism to Western herbalism to Ayurveda, nobody really knows that, and that's like, in the past like 8 or 9 years, that's become a lot more known in the alchemical community is esters. But before I had never heard of esters before I got into this. It was just, soul, spirit, and body.
Yeah. Well, and if I'm not mistaken, I think you were the first one that had brought up the concept of esterification to the point where I was really aware of it. Maybe other folks knew about it, but they weren't talking about it. If that it was the case, I think you really kind of brought that to the scene, because I remember in all of my classes for a long time, I was saying that, if you work with a plant that has a high concentration of essential oils or any resinous oil, it doesn't even have to be like a volatile aromatic compound or a terpene necessarily. It can be like a resinous oil, like let's say, like chaparral, for instance, has a lot of that sticky kind of tar type of resin. You will oftentimes see a reaction with the salts where there's like a saponification that happens, whereby you take, potassium carbonate, which has been used for thousands of years in liquid soap making, and some form of a fat. And in soap making, technically what they would be doing is like making a solution that is highly, highly, highly concentrated with potassium carbonate, and then from wood ash, and filtering out the ash, and then adding like lard or tallow or olive oil or whatever, and being able to get that soap reaction, that saponification happening. And we see that same thing in a wide variety of different spagyric tinctures. When you look at the salts, not all salts actually will stick to your glass and contain a lot of the color of the fixed sulfur of that material. Some of them are like liquid and goopy and move around at the bottom of that vessel in a really weird and strange way. And I noticed like, oh, okay, like I was mentioning earlier, a lot of those contain like alpha pinene or whatever. So I remember like teaching folks that basically there's a saponification that happens with what we call like vulgar spagyric tinctures or common spagyric tinctures. But you brought onto the scene esterification that like got me thinking about lots of different types of chemical processes that can actually be happening depending upon the constituents and how they react with potassium carbonate. And of course, I know that there's going to be listeners out there like, oh, potassium carbonate is not even necessarily the salt of the vegetable kingdom. It's like, I get that. Okay, there's salt of the vegetable kingdom that is oftentimes called potassium carbonate. The higher order of that, again, is potassium acetate. When you talk about dissolving a salt inside of your tincture, you're usually using potassium acetate. Okay, I can guarantee you guys who are listening and want to criticize us, we are well aware of that fact, but you don't get the same reactions between potassium acetate and potassium carbonate when you add them back to solutions. You get entirely different kinds of chemical reactions actually oftentimes happening, which are equally as valuable and equally, I think that deserves just as much study as we put into potassium carbonate, but it's also a little more, working with a pure glacial acetic acid is not fun, in my opinion. Working with water soluble potassium carbonate, like I could do that all day long and, put on a respirator and maybe some goggles and stuff so I don't get it in my eyes and respiratory tract. I can work with it all day long in huge, huge batches. Working with potassium acetate, considerably less fun. Like I have to have like chemical grade respirators or have to have, fume hoods and, other things like that so that it doesn't steal my breath away the second that I'm working with it, or work with it in solution, like what are those? I forget the technical name, but it's like where you add, like a certain amount of glacial or like other solvents into like a preloaded thing, and it has a little stopcock in it, and then you have like your water solution of salt down here, and it will like slowly add, you know what I'm talking about, like it will slowly drip like acetic.
Yeah. Usually, I did that in chemistry. We do titration, so
Titration,
molarity of the acid you're adding, and then you can figure out when the pH changes. There's a little asymptote that happens, and you can know, how much base was in there or how much acid was needed to neutralize that particular base, and that's how we come up with all our pH tables. But yeah, to touch on saponification, I think it's really interesting also to think of, all these oils, olive oil, oleic acid, coconut oil, caprylic acid. A lot of terpenes are acids, and we don't necessarily call them acids, but their structure is acidic. And we also see that in terms of if you put essential oil on something like plastic, or like, it'll slowly eat away at like a dropper. Oils are very corrosive because they're acidic. And so when you mix them with the salt of salts, potassium carbonate, or the body of the plant, you're also reacting with that acid. And in that sense, you have a soul body fusion that can only happen through reaction with the spirit. And that's just like a really interesting thing, because now you're taking an acid that, is typically pretty volatile, and you're creating a salt form of it, which, is now more water soluble. And so, within Spagyrics, we're able to transform the solubility of certain compounds. And that's like, outside of the alkaloid pH stuff. This is just with acids and, the soul and the body of the plant. And a lot of my passion, or just inspiration, was from Frater Albertus's First Order Elixir, where he talked about, refluxing it, distilling down the alcohol, and you get this like, something on the way to what they called a vegetable stone. And that was just really cool to see that, you can actually make this stuff happen, and you can make it pretty quick, or you could let it incubate for, a year or two, and create the same compounds. But there's just a lot of really unique things that are expressed, and you can look at them in terms of, as we talked about, a lot of chemistry, but you could also look at them in terms of, all right, we have a soul body compound now, or a soul spirit compound. These compounds are going to interact completely differently, and carboxylic acid salts, saponified products, and esters, those are like a whole class of prodrugs in pharmacology. And that's where there's, I posted a lot of that stuff because, I was trying to gain traction and credibility amongst more scientific things. Because honestly, when I started my company, I made probably like 50 different Spagyric single extracts. And, per FDA, you can't say what any of them do. And so walking up to some place that sells tinctures and being like, are you guys interested in Spagyric tinctures? And then them being like, what is Spagyric? It's just like no one wanted to have time to learn about something that they didn't know about. And sadly, a lot of herbalists, they pay good money for their education. And when they don't learn about something that you and I know a lot about, it's not the greatest sales move of like, let me teach you about something you never learned about in your expensive education. And, that's where, I just started teaching classes. But, seeing the philosophical nature of these things can offer greater insight into what these compounds can do outside of the chemical understanding of them. But through that, we also have access to a ton of clinical data where they do use different carboxylic acid salts, different esters, and different drug designs. And so we can kind of piggyback off of that and apply it to Spagyria in terms of understanding why these things work in the way that they do. But, it all began with soul, spirit, and body, and understanding how these different things react together.
It's all like philosophy at its heart, and I think it's important for people who are listening to like really understand how we moved away from alchemy. And it was because primarily of Paracelsus. So before Paracelsus, there was just the sulfur mercury theory, which was developed by an Arabic dude called Jabir, a Persian dude, but the Arabs claim him. So with that being said, Al-Jabir had the sulfur mercury theory. Paracelsus comes along and says, guys, you're dealing with salts all the time, and you're not even like incorporating it into the philosophical language and framework of alchemy. you have to think about salts. And he redefined sulfur and mercury, whereas sulfur and mercury were polar opposites. Sulfur was male, mercury was female. Paracelsus was like, salts are actually female, sulfur is actually male. That's where the polarity exists. And mercury is hermaphroditic. It can swing both ways, actually. Whereas you can have like certain solvents that will actually have an affinity to just the salt. You will have certain acids that will have an affinity to just the spirit. And usually the spirit or the salt and the sulfur, they don't usually have that amazing of a reaction just on their own. There's got to be this third intermediary process. And so it gets elucidated in these ways. And from the time Paracelsus talked about that, he also was pretty adamant that you throw out a lot of the concepts of the four elements, the way that it had been talked about since the time of at least Pythagoras and pre-Aristotle. But it's now known as Aristotelian four elements. And that continued through all of Arabic medicine and Galenic medicine and so on and so forth, so that they philosophized that there were four humors in the body and that there's these four elements. And Paracelsus revolutionized that. He was like, nah, there are four dimensions, and that those elements are actually dimensions, basically, that correspond to the Kabbalistic worlds of the physical, Asaya, Braya, Atzilut, and Yetzirah, not necessarily in order there, but those four Kabbalistic worlds. So there were four elements that you could use, especially in pyrolytic distillations. It's very clear what comes over as fire because it's a red oil. It's very clear what comes over as water because it's a white vapor. Air comes over as a yellow vapor, and earth stays behind as like this black char. So it does stay inside of the alchemical corpus, especially within the concept of pyrolysis and pyrolytic dry works. But by the time Robert Boyle was on the scene, he wrote a skeptical chemist. And his idea inside of that was basically like, I'm working with a whole lot of different things, and I don't think that just everything has sulfur, mercury, salt, and these four elements. Like, there's got to be more to be able to explain that. And that ultimately kind of was like the cracking open of chemistry as opposed to alchemy. And once they started, like once Lavoisier, was able to discover oxygen as being a type of air, a whole new chemical creation, and other people were starting to prove similar things in other chemical ways, we begin to see that the sulfur, mercury, salt, and the four element thing quickly started to fall away. And there was this mad scramble for who can identify chemicals, independent chemicals. And this whole concept of elements, the way that we think about them now in this terms of the periodic table of elements, really comes to the fore. And it was all born out of the limitation of the terminology of sulfur, mercury, salt, and these four elements. Because, for instance, I can pull a salt of salt out of the vegetable kingdom, and like I was talking about earlier, technically, chemically, I could be referring to potassium carbonate, but I could also be referring to potassium acetate. And there are some even more interesting solvents that can be used to produce other forms of potassium-based mineral compositions. So when we're talking about salts of salt, it gets a little bit elusive. Same thing if I talk about the salt of salt, say, of a particular animal. It doesn't always refer to sodium chloride, even though the vast majority of the animal kingdom actually, like tissue and blood, actually does reduce to sodium chloride. If I'm working, say, with hair, I might actually not get that sodium chloride. I'm probably going to get some sort of like silica-based mineral or a calcium-based mineral if I'm working, say, with a mollusk shell or something like that. So it's not all the way across the board. The philosophy was just not seeing eye to eye, and people were starting to recognize this. And that's what gave birth to the rise of chemistry. So it's not that chemistry like came along and just like completely disregarded alchemy. It was born out of alchemy, but realized that there were all these limitations in the terminology and in the philosophy that gave rise to it. And I oftentimes describe this to folks as saying, like, alchemy itself needed to undergo the alchemical process. And we're in a really cool time where we have the three philosophic essentials separated and purified really well. Whereas during that scientific kind of revolution and the Enlightenment period, the way that I see it is that the body of alchemy went the chemistry route. The sulfur of alchemy itself went and got relinquished to like the depth psychology type of route, Jungian psychology and things like that. And the spirit of it got separated too into like the Rosicrucian and kind of Freemasonic esoteric orders that were just performing like this kind of spiritual alchemy and kind of preserving that for a long time. There are those three major kind of divisions that separated out, and they played out especially during the 19th century. 19th century occult revival really made alchemy go to the fore. I mean, the Rosicrucian orders were really big, especially in France, Germany too, but especially in France. And then it was the French orders of the KORC that, influenced H. Spencer Lewis to create AMORC here in the United States. And AMORC still is the largest Rosicrucian order here. And they, all of their lessons, every single one of them are all about, the sulfur, mercury, and salt and the division of elements, and like everything's in Paracelsian terminology realistically. And it's all framed that way. So the spiritual tradition went that way. We have now a long-standing tradition of people who have even furthered the work of Carl Jung. And then chemistry has come such a long way, as you've been able to tell during this conversation with Warren here, that we can talk about philosophic and alchemical concepts using chemical terminology, and it actually reduces the amount of lack of clarity, I guess, is what I want to say. Like it clarifies the language and what it is that we're talking about by way of the substance or substances that are found inside of things. Like we have specific names for specific solvents and things like that. And we're in the coolest, most groovy time as alchemists, because alchemy, we have these three purified philosophic essentials ready to put back together and to create this new expression of alchemy in the modern day. And so anyway, for those of you who aren't really familiar with the history of chemistry and like how chemistry is born out of alchemy and things like that, it's kind of how it happened in a very short, concise, and not necessarily complete little way. But how do you view all of this, Warren, yourself? Like, do you, like, with your spiritual practice and your psychological like takeaways from the alchemical work, like what are some of your insights or your thoughts on this matter, and like how do you practice alchemy these days?
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of what you said is super valid when it comes to understanding the positive influences that chemistry have offered alchemy. As you said, it was kind of, it was transmuted, it was, clarified, it was crystallized, it was, like the salt is different. I know, especially when you're working with aquatic plants, they have mostly sodium carbonate, whereas land plants have potassium carbonate. I thought that was super cool. I did an algae extract and I was like, these are weird salts. And I found some reference, I forget the book, but somebody was like, oh yeah, aquatic plants have a totally different salt to salt than land plants. And so, yeah, chemistry has offered a lot of insight and the ability for us to differentiate what mercury is mercury and, what salt is salt, what kind of salt, what kind of oil, what kind of sulfur, there's a lot of differentiation that's happened because of that. I kind of view the scientific revolution as the ultimate transition from alchemy to chemistry. And a lot of that was based off of this alchemical idea that we are animated by something that you can't measure. And this was like, popular, you can see a lot of it in like Chinese alchemy and like Japanese like anime and stuff. They really adhere to these old school ideas of this animating substance that animates things. And the biggest thing that changed that was the synthesis of urea, because that was like the mecca, was like only living things make urea. And because you can't synthesize it, alchemy is supreme. And some Swedish dude synthesized urea, and that was the end of alchemy's, you know, uh, fulcrum of like knowledge. Was like, oh, okay, well, you guys synthesize urea, so I guess everything's dead. And now, because everything's dead, you can just synthesize it all, and all this
And nothing
living
matters. Yeah.
nonsense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, despite chemistry offering lots of insight into classification of different compounds, that's been extremely important. But the biggest thing I have a problem with in that is that this viewpoint that everything is dead has, really also killed our creativity, and really suppressed the idea that we can come up with new things. And this idea that we figured it all out, I think is vastly decreased the amount of experimenting scientists, alchemists, philosophers, writers, and like, you could think of like the Dark Ages as the Dark Ages, and through that we had all this Renaissance and all this art, and all this really beautiful stuff that came out of this idea that we are alchemists and we are part of nature. And through that understanding of nature, we are like extensions of this creative energy that exists in the world, through circulation, through the clouds precipitating on the mountains and creating waterfalls and oxygenating all the water that comes down to the flatlands that then, creates life. We wouldn't have any of that if we didn't have circulation. And so there's these creative energies that exist inside these dead things. Like a waterfall is, yeah, it's dead. It's just water falling, but actually it's oxygenating water, which feeds all the fish and all the algae, and then
Plants.
they, create all sorts of different byproducts through their urine and feces that feed all the plants. And so we have life, but life couldn't exist without, this idea of circulation. These alchemical ideas that are very intertwined in this idea that there's something that animates everything. And that was where, the sulfur, mercury, and salt, I think had a lot of really great insight into like everything is living. And because everything contains these three philosophical principles, they have something that animates them in some way. And because of that, there are these more energetic and volatile, forces at work here. And then when we reduce everything down to, all right, well, it's just like, potassium chloride or whatever, and it's all dead, and like, okay, there's no animation here happening. But I think, it's important to know where alchemy was and how it transformed into chemistry through a lot of modernization, and a lot of just analytical thought. It was just the evolution of humans. But I, think that it's also important to note that a lot of our inspiration for that was because we didn't have it figured out in alchemy. And I would like to say that chemistry also does not have it figured out. And although we have, all these different sets of rules, there's also a ton of exceptions to those rules. And in my mind, that exception means that really you're just memorizing facts. It's not like a end all be all. And anybody who's taken organic chemistry knows that most of those quizzes are like trick questions, and none of it is anything like intuitive. It's all like, this happens and this happens, except for when it's these two compounds and something totally different happens, and we don't know why. We don't care about the cause. We're just going to memorize that happened. And I think that there's a lot of beauty in that understanding, because of our ability to communicate to each other in a much more clarified way. But I don't like how it has given us this idea that, oh, we figured it all out. There's nothing else to figure out. And that's where within Spagyric, you can really see that we don't have it figured out. And chemistry can never explain this stuff. Chemistry helps us explain, but it can't explain what alchemy can. And so, to me, the scientific revolution was really important. But what's also important is to keep this idea of spirituality and, whatever religion you have, there's an idea of something that animates you. You're not just a bag of compounds walking around in some weird soup, blood, food, all that stuff where, there's something that animates us. And that was, some old school ideas, the homunculi and a lot of weird parts of alchemy where they were really trying to figure out what creates life, which gets into the whole Frankenstein movies of bringing things back from the dead. But you can't just mix a bunch of chemicals together and be like, that's Jeff. He's going to start talking soon. It doesn't work that way. There's some karmic, level of things happening that creates life through creation between, what we do as humans. And I think that is just important for people to also remember that we don't have it figured out. And there's a lot of, there's still a lot of mystical things out there that are important in really our creativity and our understanding of what we're capable of. And I love that idea. That was like what really brought a lot of fruitfulness to my life, was this idea in alchemy that we are these animated beings and there's something else that exists in the imponderable that we cannot measure or weigh or react with or whatever. It's not something physical. And because of that, we can create anything we set our minds to. It's not just everything's figured out.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point. I mean, even within the concept, like you were talking earlier about creating like a chemical standard, what most people don't realize is that it usually takes like hundreds to thousands of a test, and then they take a mean of all of those tests that they have performed, and then that becomes like the chemical standard. So things aren't necessarily like you don't just create something once and then like, okay, this is the standard. Like it's a mean of everything that's been created. So you're testing against a mean of like all of these different chemicals that have been made. And chemistry really discounts how much consciousness has a part to play in the process. I mean, that's for me was one of the biggest things about alchemy and still is. And like one of the things that all of my students know to a very intimate degree is like, we can call it whatever using more modern terminology. We can call it like a quantum state of consciousness whereby we know that observation is creation. And so if you're not just like trying to pretend that whatever you're observing, like you're not impacting it, if you actually utilize that force consciously, you know that you can impact the material and that material can impact you. It's like the state of observation whereby it's an active reciprocation or a reciprocal state of awareness between your materials and you. And like people who practice initiatic alchemy, which Paracelsus was adamant, like if you have not practiced alchemy, you cannot practice Spagyria. Like alchemy is not just the foundational science, but it gives you the understanding of what's going on and allows you, like the shaman, to be able to contain the medicine of the material that you're working within you. Because we might work with, say, lemon balm. The lemon balm, the bioregion that it comes from, your relationship to it, whether you grew it or not, or sourced it from somebody else, how it was dried, how it was grown, its conditions, like everything has everything to do with that individual that is that life expression of lemon balm. The patch 25 feet over is going to have an entirely different bioenergetic signature to it, or it may not, but usually it does, because they're different individuals. Just like, we're all humans, of course, but we all have individual interests and talents, even if we're of the same family. Brothers and sisters don't have the same karma, the same life goals, the same whatever, but they are made of the same genetic material. It's the same thing with plants, is like they have their own identities, their own spirits, their own everything. And when we extract that, we have to understand that that plant is a direct reflection of a component of our psyche. The concept within alchemy being that, and this stems back from, Pythagorean thought in the West, and probably Egyptian thought before Pythagoras, but the idea is that as mankind, we are the most evolved of all of the biological organisms on Earth, of all of the organisms, and not just biological, but we are the most impure as a result of that. And by impure, it's like, we talk about purity, like one atomic element is found inside of pure gold. It's just the element of gold in a few different atoms, right? Same thing with like potassium on its own. It's a metal. It's just one pure element of potassium. All of the metals are like that. Minerals are a little less pure. They're usually made of two things, like potassium carbonate, where carbon and potassium meet, or silicon dioxide, right? Like quartz. So when we get to the plants now are like a very vast difference from minerals, because they host microbes at their roots. They host microbes on themselves, yeast on themselves. They are composed of dozens of minerals, sometimes plenty of metals as well. Lots of amino acids begin to form. All sorts of different phytochemicals and constituents begin to form. They have their own hormonal system. We perceive those as hormones. The plant would perceive them as volatile aromatic compounds and other things that form within them, but it's the communication system that helps them to express stress, to express comfort, to express love, to express communication in the same way that animals do, just on a different level. And then you have animals that are even more volatile and less pure than plants. And then finally, humans that are a combination of everything. And we contain all of nature within humanity. We have metals, we have minerals. I mean, with the exception of mercury, I think we contain damn near every metal. I mean, lead is absolutely necessary, very trace amounts, but very necessary for healthy bone structure. Boron, arsenic isn't absolutely necessary. Maybe antimony isn't quite so necessary inside of the body as a metal, but there are very few exceptions to that. Like, we contain almost every single metal inside of the human body. We contain tons of minerals. We contain amino acids. We can eat the plants. We can eat the animals. We contain all of these things as our potential within us. And so we're very impure, but we're the most evolved. And because we contain all of the component of nature, that we're made of that, it's not just physical component, it's like the spiritual and psychological components. When I say spiritual, that's like that animating life force that Warren was talking about. And then the psychological components, or the psychic components of all of nature. And so we contain those things within us. And it's yeah, alchemy just gets really, really deep. And I think we're in a really cool time where we have the opportunity now to be able to take, the soulless and spiritless forms of chemistry that have just focused so much on the body, and reincorporate like that spiritual and soulful aspect back to it by incorporating alchemy back into and giving context to it. And alchemy is also really cool because in its groupings of sulfur, mercury, and salt, it's like, especially in the vegetable kingdom, like when somebody says, oh yeah, it's a sulfur, I know that it's either going to be like, a volatile sulfur, for instance, is going to be a terpene or a volatile aromatic compound of some sort. And so it gives me a filing cabinet to already understand on this macro level, like what types of chemicals I might even be looking for. You know what I mean? It's like, it's really, really cool what we have available right now, but it takes a reintegration of that alchemical perspective to be able to see it to any significant degree, and to be able to live in an animated universe again, where things actually have meaning, and it's not just, we're just synthesizing just to synthesize, or whatever. So you touched on some cool points, Warren. We only have a few more minutes here, maybe about 10 more minutes. I want to switch topics really fast, and I want you to talk about some of the
Yeah.
animating principles behind electric alchemy or electrical alchemy or the alchemy of electricity, because this has been talked about by a lot. I remember Wilhelm Reich was talking a lot about like orgone energy. Of course, the most famous of all alternative electricians, Tesla, talks about this kind of animating force and how it has a direct relationship to electricity. And this is some of the work that you're doing, in my opinion, is unprecedented, especially in the realm of alchemy these days. There's not a lot of people that are actually looking at electricity and electrical engineering from an alchemical lens, but that's something that you do. So go ahead and break it down for us and like give us an understanding from your perspective of what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it stems from a lot of philosophy from alchemy. Nikola Tesla was extremely fascinated by nature and its ability to create a ton of energy from seemingly, nothing. And so, if you just look at the world, uh, there's, there's circulation happening, and that is an alchemical idea. And that was something that really fascinated Tesla, because he was like, how can I hook into the wheelwork of nature? How is nature able to do all these things? And you can think of the clouds moving around. They're actually charges, and the charges are moving around. And so when you have a lightning strike, it's actually the meeting of two opposite polarities. And within alchemy, there's a ton of information about understanding polarities and how they react with each other. And electricity also is very similar. Back in the day, a capacitor was called a condenser because it was what condensed electrical energy to the point where you have, opposites. And when you put them back together, there's a violent reaction, a spark or an explosion that happens from these polarities reacting back together. And, back in the day, before we had AC electricity, we had DC by Edison, and DC had a lot of issues. When you turned it on, there'd be this back force, you get these back EMF spikes. And what Tesla realized was that it was not natural. There's not a lot of DC style discharges that exist in nature. There are polarities. The sky has like about like 1,000 volts per meter. Every meter you go up, it gets higher and higher in voltage in reference to the ground. But between this positive and negative, there's all these oscillations that happen. So as soon as a lightning strike happens, everything around that lightning strike goes into resonance for a small bit of time. And that resonance is an alternating current. It's going positive and negative back and forth. And Tesla designed the AC motor based off of trying to be more in tune with nature. And when he came up with that idea, he was able to create a generator that could power all of France with one generator. And that was because alternating current can travel much faster and easier down a conductor than DC. And so, again, from DC, we have all this math and physics, and then AC has its own set of math and physics because it was a completely different type of oscillatory nature. By the time Tesla gave his speech, I think it took about like 10 years for his AC motor to be adopted. And then he got into, he gave his speech, everyone's clapping, and he tells everyone they should be ashamed of themselves for not adopting this sooner. And he's already made something far superior that doesn't require wires. And that was the Tesla coil. And that was based on the inside of the earth, its resonant frequency. And he was the first person to detect cosmic rays. And cosmic rays were what he theorized was going to be the energy of the future. And cosmic rays are basically these alpha particles going at 67% the speed of light, hurled from the sun. And that is what creates the aurora borealis. and all those beautiful lights. But it's basically all the charges are hitting the Earth's atmosphere and the magnetosphere, and the magnetism of Earth is funneling those charges in the north and south poles and creating these different lights. And so Tesla was extremely fascinated with, all right, this is like the ultimate way to hook in to the wheelwork of nature, was this cosmic ray thing. And no one knew what he was talking about. He was saying he got some signals from Mars in the 1900s, the early 1900s, and everyone's like, this dude's lost it. At his conference in France, he was like, we use wires, but we can transmit information wirelessly, power wirelessly. And he also said we could transmit matter wirelessly, which is like teleportation. And that, along with his little reference to Mars sending him signals, most people thought he lost his mind. Tesla definitely was out there. He spent a lot of time in isolation and, with his thoughts. But his Tesla coil was how he measured cosmic rays for the first time 40 years before modern science was able to see cosmic rays with the cloud chamber, which is basically, instantly enough, you use alcohol and dry ice. And if you have a chamber with alcohol vapors, a charged particle, when it flies through it, will leave a little cloud trail, and you can actually see it. And if you put a magnet there, you can make it turn one direction. And depending on the charge, you can make the other thing turn the other direction. But yeah, Nikola Tesla, I think, was extremely interested in these ideas of alchemy. And Vedic philosophy was a big thing for him as well. This idea of resonance. And I also equate that to when you're boiling a tincture, it's resonating. And you probably know that boiling different tinctures, they look totally different. They make different bubble structures. And in a sense, you're like looking at the resonant, vibration of all the compounds of that plant. And so I began to see a lot of different ways of understanding, resonance in terms of alchemy and spagyric, and then also seeing that and being like, electricity is a slew of different resonances that are happening all the time, and that is, our sight, it's our sound. We live in this ether that radio waves travel through, and radio waves travel so far and so well that the substance that radio waves travel through would have to be 10,000 times more solid than steel. And yet we can walk around and the planet moves without any resistance. But these electrical waves are able to travel through this dimension, the ether, so well that it should be 10,000 times more solid than steel. And there's so much really, really cool stuff there.
Yeah, that is really, really cool. Is it because of humidity in the air that acts as that conductive particle? Because I know, we talk about lightning strikes, for instance, and that's a huge part of the creation of the Schumann resonance, is that, in the ionosphere, it's basically, theorized to be a bit like a drum, and that the electromagnetic field and magnetosphere of the Earth is kind of like the drum head. And when there are, stresses on our magnetic field and electromagnetic field and magnetosphere from solar geomagnetic activity, and possibly, also like cosmic rays and things, there's a displacement that causes that ionosphere fluctuation to happen, where it can increase or decrease that Schumann resonance. In the ionosphere, clearly this is like part of an area where clouds condense, and it's also an area where we get various forms of cloud formation. There's a greater level of humidity in the air at those levels than there are at ground. Do you think that has a part to play, or am I totally off par here?
No, I think that it's just all part of it. Basically, cosmic rays come from the sun and charge the Earth up, which then charges the ionosphere, which then creates the human resonance, which is usually around like 7.2 lightning strikes per second, 7.2 hertz. That moves around. I know that you study that. And that moves around based on the cosmic rays and the solar flares that are shooting charged particles at the Earth. And so really the Schumann resonance is a cosmic vibration. And from that, there's all these harmonics that happen when a lightning strike happens. But the ability for these charges to physically manifest as a spark, which is very similar to fire and plasma, it's a crossover between, the imponderable and the ponderable world, where if you have high amounts of humidity, you're more likely to create a spark because water is conductive. But at the same time, electricity attracts humidity because of that charged nature. And so there's all these really cool interactions that happen between charge and between the physical world. And that's where, the philosophy becomes extremely important, because there's not enough words to explain it all. And within just the Tesla coil, there's been I don't know how many different people have tried to explain how a Tesla coil works in terms of modern electrochemistry, and nobody can figure it out. There's all sorts of different models. There's this lump model. There's the radio frequency model. No one can figure out how it works. Tesla was just this is how resonance works. And it's as simple as that. And all these chemists were all these physicists couldn't figure it out. And a lot of people thought that Tesla was not a scientist, because you got Edison over there making, 500 different light bulbs to see what worked. And Nikola Tesla's just sitting there staring at the wall or looking out, at the mountains, thinking about it. And then he said that he would think about it so much, how it would work in his head, that he would just be like, well, I built the one that worked. And a lot of scientists were like, that's not science. That's mysticism. That's you're a sorcerer or something, because you're not systematically figuring out what works. You're just looking at nature and figuring out how nature works and trying to build the best representation of that. And that's where, to me, that is alchemy, is looking at nature and trying to mirror it as best as you can. And there's just so much I think that we could learn, taking kind of an alchemical philosophy and applying it to the electrical nature of our world and our life, because I think there's a lot of things that are hidden in plain sight, and it's just because we've lost this connection to spirit and science, and merging those two. And that's where alchemy is that is the foundation of alchemy, is procedural, ora labora, pray and work. You got to think about the stuff, and then you got to do it. And those are the fixed and the volatile, and we're the bridge, that mends those two together. But without that spiritual aspect, our insight is also dead, because we can't see how these things are intertwined, from physics to electromagnetism to chemistry. Those are completely different worlds, completely different textbooks, different degrees. You never learn about music theory, electrochemistry, and geology, because the rocks also have charges. They store charges all weird, and they do all sorts of really neat stuff that plays a role in why certain mountains have more lightning and other mountains don't. And there's this there's the span of it all is so encompassing. And our analytical nature, we've cut it all at the limbs, or what we think are the limbs of this body of the world. And really it's all part of one thing. And in today's age, it's very it's not very common for someone to try and understand something in so many different ways. And that's why I think a lot of alchemists will also sculptors and artists and poets. And they would practice everything, because that was the way. That was how I perceive is the way to understand everything is do lots of different things and exercise your mind in terms of chemistry and energetics and physics and music, and there's all these different parts of life, and it's also how nature works. And if we fail to understand that, I think that's where we're just not going to progress. And I don't think we have progressed a whole lot, despite how amazing chemistry is. We still use AC electricity. It's over 100 years old. We're still burning gasoline and oil. That's over 100 years old. Our phones are super advanced, but what powers them is not. And that's like the ultimate, I think, like mecca of alchemy is to understand nature so well that you can get anything you want from it through its understanding. And that's where electricity can help you grow plants with light. It can give you motive power. It can boil water. It can condense water. Electricity can do literally anything you ask of it, but you have to understand it. And our understanding of it is great in terms of battery starting your car or a light bulb, but past that, there's these forms of electricity that are much more intertwined into our own consciousness. That's like my ultimate drive. I started Evolved Alchemy to fund my electrical research because I knew I could sell stuff, but like my true passion is definitely electrical alchemy, and just keeping an open mind, because there's all these ideas of fusion and these ideas of free energy and all this stuff, and a lot of it is just like a dead end. There's also a lot that's been suppressed that is not in mainstream anything because it's dangerous. It's dangerous to like
the economic and
the
financial
oil industry. Yeah, it's very dangerous. And that's where I see that and I get that. And it's also something that has imprisoned us for a long time. And just to get back to the philosophy of it all, a lot of what we value is based on our philosophy of what we're worth. And right now, back in the day, it was like you're only worth what the gods think you're worth. And that was kind of the overarching idea. What is pious? And then now we're kind of at this philosophical nature where you're only worth the amount of work you do. And that is based on energy, because you can't do stuff. You can't buy energy if you don't work. And Earth is ever giving energy. Energy is ever present and creative. And that's where I think our philosophy of what we're worth can change if we keep going down this alchemical path of trying to understand things in a more alchemical nature, with the aid of science and chemistry and physics. But I think we have to bring that spirituality back in a way that's, like truly in resonance with the world and all it has to teach us.
Oh, dude, beautifully said. Yeah, and I talking about the interdisciplinary kind of study type of thing too, like how in our realm of specialists, we have come so far from having full spectrum kind of like perspectives on things and seeing how one subject actually bleeds into another and seeing how the whole world is connected. It's a very Da Vinci-esque kind of way of seeing things. I think it's really important. I remember reading Phil Callahan's work, who was showing, radio frequency is one of the ways that plants actually communicate with insects, and talking about like paramagnetism and other things like being so beneficial for agriculture, and tying that into what Tesla saw was like when we're using resonant frequency and transmitting it wirelessly through ground systems in particular, the plants actually seem to benefit and to thrive from it. It's like all of those fields of botany and agriculture and electricity and biomechanics and everything is all completely tied up and interrelated in those things. And we've lost context of how to see that because we're so focused on like, what is my degree? What is my specialty? Like, what is my job and how do I produce, like you were talking about, in order to, be able to make money to fund my light bulbs and my television, whatever the hell else. So yeah, it's a really fascinating time, and I have to agree with you absolutely 100%. Unfortunately, those of you who are listening, by the time this airs, you will have already missed the event, but Warren will be teaching on the alchemy of electricity at the Alchemical Revival Symposium, which is an online event held by Dennis Klosek. And Soul, and I can't remember what the rest of his thing is. I will include links down to that below because you should be able to still get a recording of his presentation by the time you guys are listening to this. But you'll be presenting more on this topic and talking for about like 45 or so minutes, basically, right?
Yep.
Super cool.
Yeah, it's the first time I'm going to be talking about it. It's been something that I've researched for really since I started doing Spagyrics in 2011. And yeah, it's just been a major study of my life. And I've spent countless dollars and countless hours on building stuff that, most of the time doesn't work. And sometimes I build stuff that does work and then it'll break and then I get to fix it. But that's like really my true passion. And a lot of it is just trying to follow in the footsteps of Nikola Tesla, because right after the 1900s, he lived till the 1940s. Because Edison was in charge of, the recorder and the projector, he didn't let anybody with that stuff get anywhere close to Tesla because he despised it. And so there's very little information on what Tesla was doing in the last 40 years of his life. And so a lot of the stuff I go off of is in that Colorado Springs notebook, which is just a 2-hour drive from where I live. And that's where he did a lot of his research and where he was totally inspired by nature and its ability to create. And so, yeah, my goal is just to keep doing that. And I'm definitely really excited to, just teach about this and give kind of more insight into these alchemical ideas and how they can be applied to electricity.
Super sweet, man. Super sweet. Well, before we head out, I want you to go ahead and tell folks kind of like what you're up to, where they can find you, things like that. And just let folks know how can they stay up to date with the work that you're doing, man.
Yeah. Honestly, Instagram is kind of my biggest like outlet of content, like Instagram story stuff. But yeah, my company is Evolved Alchemy. I'm currently in the process of rebranding. I'm gonna have a lot of different tinctures coming out. I'm trying to make. I've kind of stuck with making really potent tinctures, and as much as I love that, I know a lot of people don't. And so I'm working on making really potent tinctures that taste good, and kind of bringing more of a aspect to the idea or word elixir from Frater Albertus's first order elixir, which is how I reflux a lot of my different compounds and different tinctures. But then I'm also going to be sweetening it with honey, which is also a term for elixir, a sweet medicinal. And so I'll be making blue lotus, the sacred lotus, and saffron, all stamen versions of that flower, just because I want to get as much alkaloids as possible. All those alkaloids are also alcohol soluble, and there's a bunch of neat chemistry that I don't actually fully understand when it comes to alkaloids and spagyrics. It's something that I'm still in the process of understanding because the solubilities and whatnot, as I've explained, just get really, really wild. And so, yeah, on Instagram, you can find a lot of what I'm up to. Really in the story, I don't really like announce stuff until I'm, have it totally dialed in and figured out. And so, yeah, you can see a lot of neat and weird stuff I've done on Instagram, and I have been in a big transition. I just bought my own house earlier this year, and rebuilding my lab has been a huge project. And I like to call it climbing the ladder. As I said, I started my company to fund my electrical research, which means I can't do any electrical stuff if my business isn't running. And so I've been mostly just focusing on building out my lab again, getting that all done. And soon thereafter, I have probably a few months to go of just balancing remodeling and current projects that are happening. But then I'll be building out my electrical lab and starting to do more Tesla coiling, pulse fusion stuff. And I got this really cool bulb that shoots out these particles that no one knows what they are. It's similar to an X-ray, but you can X-ray things at like 30 to 50 feet away. Tesla said it was some other particle that he called the primary ray. A lot of this stuff is going to sound totally crazy to electrical engineers, but yeah, I'll be doing some really cool experiments with this bulb that shoots out these primary rays. Tesla used those bulbs to measure cosmic rays, and that's where he was able to actually understand that. That's my next part of that research. But yeah, as far as Evolved Alchemy, like I said, I'm a product manufacturer. I work with a lot of different people, from Chinese herbalists to Western herbalists to whatever. And if there's just someone who wants to make a product, I have different herbalists that I recommend that they can work with to get their own formula, and then we'll produce that formula based on their extraction, whether they want water extracts or purely alcohol extracts. I also just do straight up dual extractions from, water and alcohol extracts, so things like lion's mane, a lot of medicinal mushrooms. So, I kind of do everything, and I like to focus on what I do, but I'm also open to, making things that are cheaper. Spagyric is very labor intensive. And, depending on the herb, sometimes it's still really potent, just as a normal extract. And so I'm always open to just working with whatever clients are interested. And really just, I focus on the formulation, the extraction, and the investment and all the equipment and stuff. And so I can just work with people, and they can focus on, sales or their herbal knowledge or working with patients, whatever it is. And, that's what ultimately funds my fun electrical research. So yeah, all of it, I've, tried to make this encompassing, kind of disruptive thing where everybody can have good products. And I want that competition, because there's a ton of herbal products out there that are just like ground up herb in a capsule with some isolated vitamin C, and people think that it's really good for them, and there's far better things they could be ingesting. And that's where I really just believe in like sharing knowledge and making stuff for other clients so they can differentiate themselves, and ultimately we're all competing against each other, which I think is good.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, that it drives interest, it drives awareness of what's going on. It's, all sorts of different types of things like that. And yeah, business competition drives the market, as they say. So I think that in good ways, it's a good thing. And as you guys can see, like, there's a lot of camaraderie, even though, he produces Spagyrics, I produce Spagyrics, he does product formulation, I do product formulation. Like, it's not a thing where, there's bad blood about it, or negative feelings about what we do. We're so much on the same page. We end up helping each other actually quite a bit through our shared discoveries and stuff. So the whole industry ends up getting better when people continue doing what they're doing as a business. And yeah, it just drives evolution. So right there along with you, bro. All right. Well, Warren, again, I want to thank you so much for all of your time today. I know that we went like way over what I initially had told you, but man, like I could have just kept going too, because there's so many points of common interest and so many fun things that we could just continue discussing. So thank you again so much for all of your time for coming on the Alchemi-Culture Podcast, man.
Yeah, I really appreciate you having me, Phoenix. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, nothing but good things to say about you. And I'm just, stoked that we can have this dialogue and understanding. And as I've said, it's important. And I view you as someone who is really pushing that alchemical revolution. And yeah, keep going, man. And I'm all like here to support and cheer you on in that. And like, yeah, as you said, we do a lot of similar things, but it's our sharing of ideas that's really going to change the world. And that's like a currency that money can never represent. What we leave behind is our ultimate legacy. So thank you.
Totally, man. Totally. We're so on the same page that way. So, and I think it goes without saying, but I think the world of you, and actually like all of the things you said about me and like pushing an alchemical revolution, I feel the exact same way about you. That like the feeling is so mutual, man. So again, thank you so much for all of your work and for all of your time. And thank you guys who have listened to this. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, hit subscribe, go ahead and share this podcast. If there's stuff that you want to know more about, you can, of course, contact Warren directly. If there's things that I talked about that you're interested, go ahead and contact us at support@phoenixaurelius.org. And in the meantime, we just want to say thank you so much for listening. This podcast would not be a reality without y'all. And we are here to share some pretty big ideas. If you like these ideas, like I said, please share them. Get this information out there, because the more awareness that there is, the more of the pushing of the envelope we can do. And we can really create big things when we work together. So thank you guys all for listening. Until next time, keep yourselves well. Blessings of happiness and health.